Welcome back, everyone. It's great to have you here. So, in today's video, I will be talking to landscape photographer Alex Nail. And during this conversation, I cover his entire image creation process. So, first, we're going to start out with how he plans for trips and brainstorms for places he'd like to go, and then the tools and techniques that he uses to get ready for those trips. Next, we're going to review some of his favorite images and go through the camera technique that he used while out shooting in the field. So, we'll cover not only camera technique, but composition and light and how to set up for the best shots. After that, we'll review a few more images and go into the photo editing technique that he used for those. So I had a whole lot of fun with this conversation. I learned a lot from Alex, and on some of the parts, we really get into the weeds on the technique and technicalities. So I really hope you guys enjoy it. Let's start the conversation. The first thing I wanted to do for people that don't know you, I wanted you to give a little background of how you got into landscape photography and how you learned, and you can just give a little background that you would like people to start out with.
Well, I first got interested in photography when I walked into a photographer's gallery. Actually, I was on holiday in Australia, and I realised that some of these tropical, there's like long exposure river shots you see with ferns, and that's what first got me excited about photography because my parents live in a really beautiful part of the southwest of England, Devon, and it's really green there, and there's a nice little river down by their house, so that's where I started my photography. Um, yeah, and then I just started getting outdoors more. I never really liked hiking or mountains, or had no interest in it whatsoever. But I started getting out more and then enjoying it more, and yeah, kind of went from there really.
Nice. Is that area where they grew up or where you lived when you were growing up? Is that all just woodlands, or how far is it from the ocean?
No, I mean actually, the UK doesn't have much in the way of woodlands. In fact, I think it's 2% of our ancient woodland remains in the UK. So, yeah,
Whoa.
not too much woodland around. There is a little bit of native woodland there actually, but yeah, most of our landscape is either farmed or, I mean, even our national parks are farmed, which is controversial in itself because I think one of them was made a UNESCO heritage site, but it's like over farmed. Um, so it's kind of funny because you then like lock the landscape into this farming landscape rather than returning it to what it might be. So yeah, it's actually moorland. There's a moorland called Dartmoor, not far from my parents' house. So that's where I started my photography, and I still walk there now sometimes when I go back to see my parents. But yeah, it's the mountains that excite me now.
That's interesting. I think we have a lot in common there because when I first got into photography and started learning, I was more doing it as just travel photography and shooting some stuff like same with you, like getting into long exposures. And I wasn't
Mm.
into hiking or backpacking at that point either. And eventually it started to morph, and I was like, oh, well, I'd like to get more into the wilderness and kind of progress what I can see. And then saw the
Yeah.
mountains for the first time. And then once you see the mountains and you're actually out in the wilderness, at least for me, it's like game over. That's all I wanted to do as well. So that's why I'm excited for this conversation. Just to deep dive into your techniques and methods for capturing images.
Yeah, I mean, just on that side of why it's exciting being out in the mountains. For me, it's actually the combination of the difficulty with the reward. It's really intoxicating because you can
Yeah,
fail and fail and fail, but when you succeed, it is really sweet. And yeah, that's what keeps me coming back. Yeah,
I completely agree with you. It's kind of like we're drug addicts in a different kind of way. It's definitely like an
yeah,
intoxicating feeling.
yeah.
So the first thing I wanted to deep dive on is when you're sitting at home or you're sitting around planning upcoming trips, is there a specific way that you brainstorm areas that you want to travel, or how do you get excited for where you want to go next, and kind of what's the setup of how that looks for planning it?
Yeah, I mean, what one thing that's maybe slightly different about my photography to some other professionals is I don't go looking for like new countries or new mountain ranges or anything like that very often. And when I find an area that I like to photograph, I return repeatedly because a lot of the thrill I get photographically out of visiting an area is sort of building a complete picture of that area and like putting all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. And every time I visit, I see a new angle, a new way to, I mean, not exploit the area because that sounds wrong, but make the most of the opportunities that are there, and then I mean, I think one thing with modern photography is, and certainly the way I started, is you chase that one image, the spectacular sunset from the mountaintop or whatever it might be. And I think for me, increasingly, photography is great for creating an entire picture through a portfolio of work. And so that's what I try to do, have a body of work as opposed to, yeah, finding new locations. So when it comes to actually building trips and coming up with places I'd like to visit, often I'm looking back on references that I've created, either like an area that I've seen from another nearby mountaintop, or it's poring over maps of one area, and you say, oh, but what about that area that's next door? And it kind of ends up building like that. And Google Earth is a big part of that for me, because I found that the first time I went to the northwest Highlands of Scotland, I'd never seen any of the mountains there before, and I could name all of them, and I knew exactly how they fitted together because I had this like 3D model in my head. I'd flown around it so much. And I kind of have that as a reference as well, because when I'm shooting mountain scenics, I'm looking to organize the mountains in pleasing ways. So you have this like
Yeah.
background composition that you're going for, and having that kind of reference either from Google Earth or just because you've flown around enough that you've kind of got a background memory of how the mountains associate with one another. That's a big part of the planning too.
Yeah, so when you're talking about overlap for compositions, are you just talking about when you're viewing from a specific point looking back, you see, say, one mountain close to you, what's it gonna look like behind that as far as the depth of the image and just mountains overlapping each other? Is that kinda what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean that to an extent, but I mean, if I don't want mountains running into each other if possible. It's nice to have like a lineup of mountains where they're all distinct and identifiable, and
Yeah.
understanding where you need to be physically is quite important from a planning perspective, because you can't just walk 5 miles to rearrange the mountains.
Right.
So a lot of my composition when I'm in the mountains is effectively background first. So I mean, I talk about this increasingly because I didn't really realize I was doing it, but I like to break up the mountains in very specific ways. And that effectively will set my focal length and the direction that I'm pointing. Because when you're in a location, you cannot change the relationship of the mountains because you need to walk too far. And so this then gives
Mhm.
you a hard, like, you fix some of the degrees of freedom, if you like, if you want to go down the engineering line,
That's a good way to put it.
because direction and focal length are already fixed. So all you can do is physically move your position to bring foreground elements into the frame. So yeah, I plan around that backdrop quite often because that's the foundation of the image. That's my starting point, and then I work back from there.
Yeah, it's interesting about the, part of your own points that you drop on a map are what you come back to, because that's the exact same thing I do. It's almost
Mhm.
like every trip when you go out and you keep repeating trips into a specific area. And I think sometimes when people think, oh, you're going back to a specific area, well, what I've found is the more I explore a big wilderness area, the larger it gets because you get into one specific basin that has drainages and mountains all around it. And you get to it and you're seeing all these other areas and they might have trails to them or not. But you're like, oh, well, I can get over there and then I can see how the light's hitting from this trip and I can study that and
Yeah,
look back at it and I'll be like, oh, well, that's definitely somewhere I want to go next. So then I just pull out my phone and I drop a GPS location in a little folder I have that's come back and scout this place. And then it's just like a repetitive cycle as you learn the
yeah,
light, the
absolutely.
light in the area, like the weather in the area. And see if you feel like this. I just feel like when you return again and again, the potential for getting better and better shots just continues to improve because you know the dynamics of the light, the weather, and everything else. It just gives you an edge, especially in the mountains where things are really moving fast.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely true. Although I think another good thing about returning to a place is knowing that you can return again as well, which kind of takes some pressure off. I there have been locations that I've gone to knowing that it's probably going to be the only time that I go there. Greenland was one of those, and it does put
Mm,
pressure on you. You're there for just one attempt, and I see that with workshop clients. They know that they're not going to come backpacking multiple times in Iceland, and so when they have that epic sunset, they kind of lose their minds because there's so much pressure. They're like, "Oh my god, this is the moment." And yeah, you
yeah.
need to take a bit more of a zen approach, I think, to make good photographs.
Absolutely. That's one of the main differences I found. I guess I started shooting professionally or at least full time about 6 years ago, and I'd been taking images for about 6 years before that. And the difference in mindset, I just remember like my first year shooting full time, I was like, "Hey, you don't need to be designing trips like you used to where you have this perfect schedule where you're hitting spot after spot and hoping for the best." It's just such a difference in the mentality that starts to grow on you
Mm,
when you're like, "Okay, now I have all the time. The goal should be to design trips that produce the best images." And at first, that's hard because sometimes you're just sitting and waiting in spots and you're like, man, I'd like to do something, but I know the light's going to be good tonight and it looks like it's
yeah.
going to be an awesome sunset. And sometimes you have to wait it out. And that can be hard at first because it's always fun to be on the move too. So that's a balance that I still
And
have
I
a hard
think
time with.
I think you do that to a greater extreme than I do, actually, because I know you'll go out for a couple of weeks at a time on your own, and I never do that. I just get kind of bored and lonely. I'm a social person, and
Yeah.
I think that like experiences for me are just far better shared, and it actually doesn't matter who they're shared with in many ways. So if that's workshop clients, then that's great as well. But I just love that excitement, that feedback, that human element. Um, and so I don't tend to go out for 2 weeks thinking, oh, well, I can set aside 3 days to stay in this one location. I'll do 5, 6, 7 nights in a row, and usually not more than that, unless I'm in a place where I can kind of rely on the weather a bit more. I mean, I think the weather factor is a big one. Uh, I mean, in Scotland, you can't trust the weather forecast more than 2 days out, really, unless you've got like a monster high pressure system
Yeah.
coming through or something. And so it makes it very hard to commit to really long trips. But more than that, because we don't have true wilderness, there's no great benefit to doing trips that long without, say, returning to the car or whatever, because you're just carrying the extra weight in food. And
Yeah. I would bet that where I live, which is about 49 degrees north latitude. Where how far up are you in latitude?
I think we are, well, it's misleading in the UK. So I think we're 55 degrees north. So in theory, it should be very cold here, but we have the
Yeah,
warming influence of the Gulf Stream, which gives us a massive temperature variation compared to our latitude. And incidentally,
right.
that keeps on going all the way up to the Lofoten Islands in Norway, which has the greatest temperature variation in the world for its latitude. But yeah,
Because the Pacific North Oh, go ahead, I
no, go
interrupted
on.
you, go ahead.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
I think our weathers are very similar. The Pacific Northwest has the exact same thing because 'cause we're right on the water or in the ocean.
mhm,
So we have
yeah,
tons of dynamic weather, and just like you were saying, like 2 days, 3 days, they'll have a weather report, but don't plan on it being anywhere close to near correct, right? I
yeah,
found that I use this Garmin InReach Mini, and the weather on this thing, you can get up to the like date daily. It's better than even like our government weather reports. It's like I'll dial into this, it shoots up to a satellite, and it'll give me
mm,
hour by hour, and it'll say rain's coming at 2 p.m. and rain will roll, and it's insane. Awesome
yeah,
tool.
that's handy.
Yeah, super nice. It's a game changer for being out for long trips because if I'm seeing like a storm roll in, the only way I can stay out for 2 week trip is that if I see a bad storm rolling, I'll get to a good spot and I'll just set up my tent and be like, all right, well, you're probably going to be here for a few days. So I'll still stay dry and it just gets
Yeah.
boring. But you should come visit. The social interaction's definitely nice. I'll take you out
Yeah,
backpacking.
it'd be cool. You'd whip me up some mountains, I'm sure, because yeah, we don't have mountains as big as your mountains, so we don't have wilderness as wild as. In fact, we don't have any wilderness at all in Europe, really. Just Sarek National Park in Sweden is effectively the only wilderness. In fact, I listened to your conversation with Matt Payne the other day,
Oh,
and
nice.
yeah, it was really interesting. But I think you said something like you said to Matt, "Can you point me in the direction of some photographers who like really go out into the wilderness?" And he was like, "Oh, I don't know that I can." And the reason he can't is because it's really only America that has a lot of photographers and a lot of wilderness. So if you guys don't know the Americans, then yeah, odds are stacked against you. Because like in Europe, there's just absolutely no point going out into the wilderness for 2 weeks because there's roads everywhere, and
Yeah, you'll run out of spots to visit. So I
yeah.
wanted to shift this into the next thing that I was really interested in talking to you about, and that was basically So we just went over trip planning and like getting up setups for the shot. So the next part is when you're out there on the trip, and let's say you get to a spot that maybe you looked for online, or maybe you just came across it and it looks cool to shoot, and you set up your tent and you have a spot to camp for the night. Is there anything that you do before sunset or sunrise that gets you set up for specific shots, or what's your in the field kind of methodology for finding what might be a good composition and dedicating your time to shooting that? Because you have some awesome mountain images.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I just spend as much time as possible before the light is good, and I'm very precise about the way I form my compositions, the exact plan that I have. And part of that is doing what I mentioned earlier, trying to frame the backdrop first so I kind of know my focal lengths, and that solves part of the puzzle. Then when I'm hunting for foregrounds, I know what I'm looking for, at least in terms of direction, to try and combine the backdrop with the foreground elements. Um, but I try to do all of that, like perfecting the composition as much as possible beforehand. Of course, when the light hits the scene, you might not quite anticipate it perfectly, and then you need to adapt, and that happens more often than not, to be perfectly honest. Um, but there have been times when when you see that perfect gap on the horizon, and you just know that you're going to have the best light of your life for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I am very, very
Mhm.
methodical when those moments happen. I'm I mean, the first thing I will do is look for the one image and focus on that. I mean, I think that's a great tip for anybody who wants to pursue landscape photography seriously, is to make sure that you have the one image and be very confident in your ability to execute that image. And then build everything else around that. I mean, and there have been occasions when I've had that 5 minutes and I've literally ran between compositions, perfectly repeating the shots that I took earlier in flat light to make the most of that moment. And then inevitably only one of them works or whatever. But I mean, that's the way it goes.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a ton of overlap there. And I think one of the biggest things that I've learned is what you just said. Before, like, let's say I just get to camp and I get an area that I really want to shoot. Before sunset, maybe hour, 2 hours, whatever, I'll just walk around with my camera handheld and I'll just kind of brainstorm some composition. So I'll just set up everything in the composition and I'll just take a
Mhm.
snapshot. It doesn't have to be ideal. And then I'll go back to my tent and I'll look through the 8 or 10 that I have and I'll be like, oh, well, looking at the back of the camera, I like this one the most. And then I like this one the second most. And usually I'm just going to work on one, like you said. I'm going to work on it
Mm.
until it's perfect. And if by chance the light's still going on after I dial that first one, and then I'll go to that second one I determine. But I think that's an awesome tip for anybody is that just work on one shot until it's perfect, because if you have 10 shots of sunset and they're all average, nobody wants to look at 10 close to the same shots in a portfolio generally. It just gets boring, right? But if you have like one
Yeah.
really killer shot from a spot under good light, that's how people look at it and they're like, oh, this guy's got it, right? And I think that's a mindset that I didn't get at first. And once you get it and start following it, it feels weird because you feel like you're missing out. But once you
Mm.
get it and you're like, oh, I got a lot of good shots now because I'm just concentrating on that one, it makes your mind not wonder the whole time, well, I should be over there shooting instead.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of goes to the comment I made about beginners, being presented with this incredible moment as well and putting a lot of pressure on themselves. I mean, that pressure only gets worse if you're trying to make the most of it by shooting 10 different shots. And I think if you can sort of calm down and just think, what do I want to photograph? I mean, I'm not going to name drop here, but I went I took some very talented photographers to the Drakensberg, some of whom who shoot a lot, some of whom shoot less, but all very good photographers in their own right. But we had some really exceptional conditions out there. And there was this one particular morning where one of these guys was just running around. He's going, I don't know what to shoot. And I was just like, calm down. If if you can't find a foreground, just shoot the view, compose it nicely. Just don't worry about it. If you don't get a shot, it's not a big deal. And I
Yeah.
think that kind of thing does help a lot too. Just relaxing a bit.
Yeah. So, what I wanted to do now is, since we're talking about camera technique, we'll dive into it a little bit more. But I first wanted to
Mm.
talk about the images that we determined that we were going to talk about first. The first one is the panorama image that has foreground of yellow light and then it kind of transitions into blue. And for
Mm.
anybody that's just listening, I will provide links to these in the show notes. You can click on them and look if you like to. So when you're out getting set up for this shot, what made that the shot that you chose? And once you chose it, was there a specific way that you actually go through your camera technique? And you can get like technical here and talk about like your methods for camera technique or shooting or anything else you like.
Yeah, so this photo is kind of the epitome of me working fast and being technically proficient. I mean, I suspect you and I may have gone through a similar thing when we started photography, that we absolutely wanted to nail the technical side. I mean, I read manuals, I read website articles, I wanted to know everything there was to know about f-stop and so on.
Yeah.
But I'm also pragmatic, and I try to get rid of technique in my process as much as possible. I mean, of course, I want perfect technique if I can, but I also don't want to be thinking about it,
Yeah.
and that's where custom modes come in for me. So I use custom modes very heavily, and they're very important to me when the light is changing rapidly, which can happen whether you're in the mountains or not. But in the mountains, when you're physically tired and potentially mentally tired, that's when you can make mistakes. And it then becomes even more important for me to have these custom modes. So that photo is an exposure bracket, and actually I should probably send you the time lapse, because this was an amazing scene. This is on the Drakensberg Escarpment. They're like 3,000-meter cliffs, and there was this huge wave of mist rolling in. So it formed in the valleys below us and then just crashed up over the cliffs. And that's what you can see on the right-hand
Oh,
side of the image
nice.
there. But it's moving in really fast. And I've seen this happen before many times in the Drakensberg, never at sunset quite like this. And I knew that we had seconds, and I literally ran to get to the location, and I framed up the scene, because this is a transient moment. I mean, you just need to get shooting and not mess around, simplify as much as possible. There were some good grasses and so on that I could have composed, but you start messing around with that stuff, you're going to miss the moment. And then I'm onto my custom mode 2, which is my exposure bracket. I know that it's a 3-stop exposure range. It's f11, it's ISO 100, and all I do is I half press the shutter button, and I'm looking at my histogram immediately to see whether the darkest exposure retains the highlights, and that's all I'm looking at. And then I let the 3 exposures run, and so that's just 2 horizontal frames
Mm-hmm.
to get that scene, and then it was gone. And I ran there. I took 2 exposure bracketed sets of frames, and then we were in cloud. Game over. And this was with those photographers, and some of them got the moment, those that were already set up to shoot it, and some didn't. And I think, you know, being fast is a huge advantage if you can be fast and precise.
Yeah. Yeah. Like this is an image that if the light died in the foreground or any of that shadow on the left hand side, that wouldn't be an image, right? Like it needs the light in the foreground and needs that light on the clouds on the right hand side because it gives that awesome transition of that warm in the bottom to the blue in the back. And it just pulls your eyes from center of attention where it's super sharp in the foreground and just draws them back in with a change in color, which is super nice. Really nice image. Oh, I had a question
Thanks.
about when you're exposure bracketing, you take that first shot and you're just looking at the highlights. Are you exposing to the right, or how are you pushing your histogram to maintain the highlights?
Yeah, I mean, I actually want to do a video on expose to the right, because I think that was a technique that was absolutely brilliant when I started photography, when
Mm-hmm.
the dynamic range of sensors wasn't that good, and highlight roll off was absolutely horrendous as well. Like modern cameras are so much better in terms of highlight roll off. Now I think I can be a little, again, this is kind of where pragmatism comes in. I know if I underexpose by half a stop, the image is basically going to be exactly the same when I've
Yeah.
edited the raw file. So I tend to err on the side of being conservative. That said, with a bit of experience, you kind of know from an editing perspective when you need to blow the highlights, which is maybe kind of a transitions onto the next photo. It's this shot of Norway, because there I'm trying to keep the
Oh,
sun as
nice. Yeah.
bright as possible, because it's the light source, right? And I think one temptation is
Right.
that you underexpose the sun so much to get as much color as possible, but then it doesn't end up as a believable level of luminosity within the image. And that's something that I've done increasingly. Actually, that's one of the few ways in which my editing has changed in the last 6-7 years. Um, it's really keeping those highlights bright, having nice highlight roll offs. So sometimes I expose, to go back to your question, under what I need to, but quite often I will just let it be around that clipping point, because that darkest exposure in the set, because I know that ultimately I'm going to want to keep those highlights nice and bright.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very close to what I do. Is I mean, if you have a newer camera, the dynamic range is so ridiculous, especially if you've shot
Mm-hmm.
with older cameras and you realize how much better they've got. You're just like, "Oh man, this is crazy." But usually I'll just expose to the right, but if I'm shooting red or really bright yellow, I'll back off like a third to a half of a stop. Now, you're looking at the
Yeah,
RGB histogram on the back, so you could probably just expose to the right for everything and you'd be fine. But if you miss it even by a stop, as long as you're not clipping, you're all good. And even on that photo that we're looking at right now, if you clip like 5% where the sun is, it's probably going to be clipped in the final image anyway. But that's something hard to learn until you shoot a whole lot of images and really know your camera, right? It's impossible to
yeah,
know that.
exactly. I think I think if anybody's watching this though, and they're wondering, oh, do they expose to the right, do they expose to the left, and so on. I mean, protect your highlights. I would say, because you can always brighten things up, and modern cameras are so good. I think the problem with exposed to the right ETTR is that it's like this big technical thing that's like, oh, you did expose to the right, didn't you, to get the best quality? Oh, I exposed to the right and I only shoot at the lowest ISOs and all this kind of stuff. It's almost like a bragging
Yeah.
right. It's like, who's the most technically proficient. If you're messing around with your camera trying to achieve the perfect exposure and a transient moment's happening, then you might miss that moment, or you might be focusing your energy on technique rather than on creativity, which is another problem with some of the more technical aspects of photography.
Yeah, I agree, man. That's why it's so important that if you're just starting out, or even if you're like an intermediate and you don't have a step-by-step process where not the step by step for composition and stuff like that. That should be artistic. But
Hmm.
when you're shooting, it should all just be muscle memory. You shouldn't be thinking about, is this the right setting, or is like, do I focus now or do I dial the exposure now? There's not like a right or wrong method how you do this. But if you have a process and it's muscle memory, then you can think about light, color, and composition. And that's the stuff that is really going to separate good images from bad images. It's not if you shot at f16, ISO 250, or f11, ISO 80 or something. None of that matters that much in the scope of things once you learn it to begin with.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I mean, basically, if you're starting out, really work on technique so that it is very natural to you. So that if it's windy and you need a shorter shutter speed because you're going to get a blurred shot, then you absolutely
Yeah.
know how to deal with that situation. But also to the point that you know that if you are shooting f16 and not f8, who cares if you lose a little bit of absolute sharpness? It does not matter. You just need to be
Yeah,
confident in what you're doing so that when you're presented with these opportunities, you can capitalize on them and be artistic.
absolutely. Another good thing that is really helpful, every camera and lens setup is going to be different, but I always tell people to find what their max usable ISO is. And then as long as you're under that, you're fine. So, like for the Z7 that I shoot with now, I can shoot up to like ISO 800 and I don't really see
Hmm.
degradation until about there. So, if you're under conditions where the light is changing and you need to jack your ISO up for a second, then you know you can go up to 800 and not even think twice about it, or whatever you determine that to be. So
Yeah.
people just take a bunch of shots at one stop difference, start at 200, 4, 8, keep going up, and then overlay them in Photoshop and see at full resolution where does it drop off and you get a bunch of color noise and degradation. And then as long as your
Yeah.
ISO is under that, it's all good. The same with exposure. Take some really underexposed shots at like -2 or 3 EV under what they actually should be and see how much darks you can pull out of it. And then if you're in a trouble spot and you're like, well, I need to really underexpose this and jack the ISO up because I need a fast shutter, then do it and you're going to be fine. But if you don't know the bounds of where those lie, then you're going to second guess your shooting all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's really good advice, and especially, I mean, modern cameras are so good now. I mean, I started shooting on a Canon 20D back in 2006, and you know, the way things have moved on from then, it's just absolute night and day. You can push files a long way if you need to. But yeah, just understand what that line is for you, and also really think about noise, because there is a bit of an obsession about noise. And I've done some really big prints of some quotes noisy images, and quite often the noise may even be
Mm-hmm.
a good thing rather than a bad thing. I've never really printed a shot and seen the noise on the wall, and you know, so it gets to a point where you're worrying about something that maybe isn't such a problem.
Yeah. Especially if you're pushing your exposure really bright, you're not gonna like the amount of noise in the individual pixel is gonna be so minimal compared to the signal of the light that you're not even
Yeah.
gonna see, like, you might be shooting at ISO 800, but if your exposure looks good, you might not see that noise at all when you get back, and
Oh
it's all
yeah, I mean,
camera by
no
camera.
chance. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
A
for sure.
and that's a huge thing to learn is because, like, there's bounds on what every camera and lens setup can do, and as soon as you know that bounds, then your confidence level goes through the roof, and once your confidence
Mhm.
level's up, then that's when the shots start to get way better because 'cause you're like, "I know I'm nailing this one," and it's all a composition and light game at that point.
And I think all of this feeds into some of the topics that you've discussed in your videos, actually, about actually understanding what you're doing, so that when you hear other information, you know whether it's good or not. I mean, to be honest,
Yeah.
I haven't watched all of your videos. I've watched, I don't know, probably a few hours worth, because I kind of like watching you just get
What?
out there and go hiking. Um, because I don't watch many photography videos, to be honest. I like
I
seeing
don't
people
either.
going out on adventures. But yeah, you did one where you're going out on about camera straps flapping in the wind. And if I
Yeah.
had a penny for every time somebody had told me off for letting my camera strap flap in the wind, I mean, it just isn't a problem if you do any sort of testing. And so there's a lot. All I'm saying is there's a lot of information out there that just isn't really based on much, or it's like theoretical. Okay, you know,
Yeah.
if you shoot at f11, it's slightly better than f13, but it actually doesn't matter, and you need to understand whether it matters. Otherwise, you've just got a million different ideas flying at you all the time, and it doesn't help you be a better photographer.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is because if you in physics or in engineering, they call these first principles. It's what the world is actually built on and how things actually function in reality. And if you spend your time instead of memorizing what somebody's doing in a specific circumstance and hoping that that'll work in another one, if you understand the first principles of how the world actually works, then you can call bullshit when people say something that doesn't actually make sense. And like you said, like a lot of theory is fine, but it doesn't apply in the real world. And if you
Mhm.
have a bullshit detector that says, well, that might be what you say, but it's not true, then you cannot have to worry about this bombardment of constant information that's a good and bad aspect of line. You can learn a lot now for free or learn for premium videos from people, but if you can't test it in your own mind and say, hey, is this real or is like this something I actually need to know? Then you're going to be doing a bunch of useless stuff all the time and you'll never actually improve. So that's, I think we have a lot of overlap in our mindset there, which is fun to talk to somebody like that.
Yeah, and I think that problem's actually only compounded by professional photographers, to be honest, because of course all of us like to think that we've got something new to offer whoever we're talking to, whether it's, you know, on YouTube or during a workshop. We, you know, and so people want to know what your idea is on something, but having a different approach doesn't make it any more valid than anybody else's, just because you're their favorite photographer or you happen to be watching their video or whatever it is. And you don't
Hmm.
need to learn a million different approaches. You need to understand the fundamentals so that you can come up with your own process that works for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then once you have those fundamentals down, man, when I teach people in workshops, I'm like, if you really want to get good camera technique, take every step of your technique that you're going to do out in the field and write it down. So whether it can be whatever you want, but for me, it's composition. Then you focus. After you focus,
Mhm.
that focus has got to be first, because you can't see the light coming through if you don't get the focus
Hmm.
first. And then just start to dial in, well, what do I do next? Well, the next thing I do is select the f-stop that I want. From there, I select the exposure that I want. And then if I want to control the shutter speed, I just crank the ISO up or down. And it's not a
Hmm.
right or wrong method to use for any type of shooting, but if you have that and you can write it out, then you can look at any parts of that step by step and say, well, this is garbage. I don't need it. You can toss it out and you have extra seconds to make better decisions. And you were saying earlier, you're pragmatic and you want to simplify the process, but still understand what you need. And I think
Hmm.
that's one of the biggest missed things with people having a lot of information online is that they say, well, more is better. But for photography, camera technique, and even photo editing, less but more targeted and better knowledge of what you're actually using is way better, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, there's kind of two aspects to photography. There's the craft, and then there's the art. And you don't want to let the craft overtake the art at any point. Now, you need to master the craft, otherwise, the art's not going to be good enough. Um, but there's a limit
Mhm.
to that. You don't need to be perfect. Yeah,
Yeah,
so yeah, if you can find any way to allow you to put your energy into the finding the composition, coming up with creative ideas, that's what you should be doing.
completely agree, man. Glad we have some agreement on those things. I think if somebody would have told me that when I started out, it would have seriously saved me years of trying to learn. Like back in the day, before there was lots of YouTube videos, you would just go on somebody's website and look at their images, and you'd be like, how did he do this? And I always thought that pro photographers had like these secret tricks or methods that they were using when I was first learning. And then over time, you just edit a bunch of photos and you're like, now actually, they just constantly work on images and they see what works and doesn't work and they make their own process and then they just optimize it. It's not like they have this
Hmm.
secret plugin or this
Exactly.
secret thing that works. Because whenever you're even with photo editing, which we're going to go into next, but when you're editing a photo, you have a million tools. There's only two things you can do. You can change the color or the lightness value of the pixel. That's all you get. So when it comes down to editing, you're only changing the color or the light. You don't need a billion tools to do that. You need an understanding
Hmm.
of some really good tools. I saw your levels video the other day that you put out on YouTube. Everybody should
My
check out,
curves video.
or curves. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
yeah,
I blew it.
yeah.
The curves video. I was thinking about levels versus curves. But the curves video, if people just get a good understanding of that video, they can go to your channel and check it out. But if you understand that at the first principles level of what's happening, you can just use that for everything and you'd be basically set.
Yeah.
Um, so it's like simplify, learn, and then simplify. And you can't simplify until you really learn the underlying foundational knowledge.
Yeah, and I mean, on the editing side, you really don't even need Photoshop and curves. I mean, I think if you want to take your editing to the point where it's perfect, for want of a better term,
Mm-hmm.
then mastering Photoshop is a good way to do that. And the difference there is, you know, once you've taken the photo, you've got time to edit, hopefully, and so perfecting at that stage isn't getting in the way of the art. In fact, it might even be enhancing the art. So being technical at that stage is good, but Photoshop is the last 5% for me, and everything else is in Lightroom,
Mm-hmm.
and using mostly the basic panel and then local adjustments in Lightroom. Yeah, so I mean, I've done a video on that because I think that there is a lot of editing information out there that is incredibly confusing, really advanced techniques. And that's not to say that these techniques don't work, because they definitely do. You know,
Yeah.
luminosity masks is one. I think you use luminosity masks. Um,
I do
do you use?
sometimes. I
Yeah,
use a lot of hand painted mask and luminosity.
yeah.
They're just my
So
own. I
so
just have actions that I created for myself that just loads them all up, basically. I don't
yeah.
use anything beyond like luminosity channels, though. It's not like I have these super high tech methods that I use
No,
besides
sure.
those.
But I mean, I'm just using that as an example of a technique that actually works very well, but it might scare somebody. And there are other simpler techniques if you want to do that. Now, if you want to make really specific luminosity selections, then actually luminosity masks are a very good way of doing that. And that's when you might need
Mm-hmm.
to learn that next step. But yeah, I think the editing side, again, people can get bogged down in the details, learning complex techniques, and then forget about what they actually want to do to the image, which is so important because it can actually take a long time to develop a good visual understanding of color, contrast, exposure, the role that different parts of an image play. Keeping your highlights bright, keeping your shadows dark, but somehow bringing detail into the shadows whilst keeping your shadows dark. That kind of thing. Recognizing what accurate white balance is, recognizing the true color of things. All those kinds of concepts are very important if you want to produce a really high standard of imagery, and all of those complex techniques get in the way of that understanding.
That's a great way of putting it. It's almost like there's the way I see it is there's a lot of time spent learning the hardest, maybe 2 to 5% of techniques without understanding the 95% that underlies it that actually gets all the work done for you. So
Yeah.
instead of concentrating on the stuff that you just talked about, where you have a true understanding of color and light on the scene, that will get you farther than almost anything because just hitting the white balance and seeing color cast within the image where they shouldn't exist removes all the separation and the depth from the image. And that's where a lot of people lack, including myself, of course, sometimes. And just being able to see that is something that you don't get until you just constantly edit and constantly shoot and train your
Mhm.
eye to match what you saw at the landscape to what you produce on the photo editing side. And it's just a hard skill set to learn. It's definitely a learned skill.
And it's also a hard skill set to teach, whereas teaching techniques and processes is relatively straightforward, which is why I think a lot of people end up slightly skewed. Like I've seen people on workshops using luminosity masks, using really advanced upsizing and sharpening methods, and quite often not applying them very well.
Yeah.
And they haven't got the white balance right at the first step, or they've got a horrible highlight roll off, or there's all sorts of really fundamental issues, but they've invested a lot of
Hmm.
time in a tutorial series that says, oh, use this method, because which is great if you really understand everything else that goes before it, but unfortunately there isn't much in the way of teaching about what goes before it. Like, there aren't many people shouting about white balance.
Yeah.
White balance is so important.
It is. Have you ever heard of the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule before?
I have heard of that, but no, I couldn't repeat it back to you, so you'll have to
Yes.
tell me.
So here's what it is in simplicity. And I think it's a great thing to apply to all of life. It basically says that 20% of your inputs into anything in life will produce 80% of the results. So if you just concentrate all on just 20% of tactics that are the fundamentals that really get you good results, it'll produce you 80% of the results. So
Mhm.
that would basically mean cutting out the remaining 80% of fluff from the shooting process, from the editing process, or anything else. And if you just perfect that 20% of heavy hitters, it'll produce the 80% of the results for you. And you can be like, oh, well, now my photos are getting good really fast because I'm an expert at this 20% that gives me most of the outcome I want. And then you can slowly, after you learn that really heavy hitting 20%, you can start to deep dive into the extras that you need to really step your game up to the next level. But doing it in reverse doesn't get you the same results, just waste your time. Does that make sense?
No, it does, and most people don't know what that 20% is. I mean, to be honest,
That's the hardest thing.
exactly, and it's not well communicated in photography, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, in some ways, I was quite lucky in that I've always tried to focus on producing realistic imagery. So I never took any interest in any of these advanced techniques, because quite often they were
Mm,
aimed at achieving things that I didn't want to achieve in the first place. And that did allow me
yeah.
to spend more time focusing on things like white balance. But it also makes me quite a boring person in terms of like the editing. Like, everybody wants the newfangled technique, that that magical fairy dust that you were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
and I don't have that. I just have fundamentals to teach.
Um, but it's what I find is very hard to do is describe the fundamentals that matter in a way that really resonates with people because it's very hard to look at an image. Like, we'll look at another one of your images here in a second, but when you're editing these images, it's hard to look at it and know what the specific colors should be. So it not only draws the attention of the viewer with different saturated colors and different desaturated colors, but it also looks realistic. That is such a hard thing to learn. And I don't know if it can be described well, but you can definitely learn it through lots of failure and repetition. Um, and I don't know how
I
to go about really teaching it in a really good way. I'm getting better at it, but there's still not like a great way to do it.
I mean, I have some ideas on how I'd approach that myself, and a lot of it is firstly around telling people not to go crazy with color, because I think I've seen so many people. I mean, I've been taking photography seriously for more than a decade now, and I've seen loads of people's styles change over time. And one thing that's
Hmm.
fairly constant is if people ever move into a really saturated style, they will eventually move back into a less saturated style because they realize that
I've done that.
oversaturated colors, yeah, if you oversaturate your colors, you lose the quality of the color, the subtlety and the beauty of the color in a way that you maybe don't recognize at the time because you're captivated by the impact of the color, the big wow moment.
Hmm.
Um, and as you see more of these fantastic moments and fantastic photos, you suddenly realize, oh, hang on a second, there's beauty in the subtlety. And so people will then take a step back from saturation. So, I mean, I would start by saying never saturate. Basically never saturate. I mean, for me, my saturation comes through contrast. So when you add contrast, you add lots of saturation anyway. So if you're
Hmm.
adding extra saturation, you're probably going too far. And of course, there are always exceptions, but I think that's a decent general rule. But the other one is white balance. It is so important. And I would say to everybody, understand what light is actually doing. The good thing about cameras is that they are effectively scientific instruments. The way we use that data
Hmm.
is is the art, but they are very reliable truth tellers, cameras in their own way. Of course, every camera is different and so on, and there's no perfect truth or anything like that. I get all that side of things, but if I put my camera on 5,500 Kelvin white balance, then I know roughly what the light is doing in comparison to daylight. So I know if the light is golden or blue, or and how blue it is. So if we're shooting in blue hour, my eyes will take out a lot of that blue because I want to be able to see that the
Hmm.
grass is green and the rock face is grey, and the eyes just take a lot of that color away. Now, not all of it, but quite a lot of it. The camera doesn't if you set it on 5,500 Kelvin. So the truth really can be either of those two things or somewhere between, right? It has to be blue, but how blue? Well, maybe up to where the camera at 5,500 Kelvin would be, or back to where your eyes have adjusted. But I think if you start getting a feel for that sort of thing, you start getting a sense of what true color is. And also when you creatively want to move away from truth, right, and into using white balance creatively, which one of
Hmm.
these photos, yeah, I picked because I thought it was kind of
Yeah, let's pull up
interesting
that
to
next one.
discuss. Yeah, so actually it's the fourth one there. So it's the one of the pinnacles with the mist behind it there. Um, so
Yep. Yep. Got it.
usually I do shoot at 5,500 Kelvin, but that one has a much cooler white balance because I noticed that some of the mist was lit by the rising sun, so it had this incredibly rich golden light on it, almost like oppressively orange. But what that means is that you can set a colder white balance and the orange is still going to dominate as you do that. So then you can create this color contrast between blue and orange. So that's me moving away from what I would usually do with white balance to achieve an effect. But that does come from understanding, like recognizing that the sunlit cloud is very orange. So when you set a bluer white balance, it's still going to be orange.
I think what I really like about this image, and a mistake that I've made tons of times, and I'm sure everybody makes, is when people look at specific colors. For example, like the blue and orange in this scene, a lot of people will say, well, yellow or orange is a really bright color. So they'll push
Mhm.
the histogram brighter and brighter. And what actually is the truth about light and color in the scene, every color specifically only exists at a specific lightness value. So if you take what is a really nice looking orange and you brighten up your image too much, that orange will change into a different color of orange and closer to yellow. And then you'll also lose all the underlying detail. The same happens with saturation, right? If you would have overly
Yeah.
saturated any of these parts, such as the yellows and the blues, you would have lost all the texture and detail because the saturation would have overwhelmed that texture and detail. So oftentimes sharpness in the image doesn't come from sharpening or adding different, you could say, like special effects to get the sharpness. It
Mhm.
actually comes from keeping the color and light where they actually exist, because then all the underlying detail will stay within the image. And that's such a hard skill to learn, but that's what I like about your photos, is that you do that really well.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is, the less is more thing. I mean, it's
Mhm.
just it's so often true, and particularly with editing. And I mean, it's quite encouraging to see that after nearly a decade of things getting more and more extreme, I think there are photographers now walking the other way, and going to levels of subtlety that I almost think are excessive. But I'd much rather see that than the other extreme. But it's very true what you say about color. If you're changing the exposure, the brightness, whatever you want to call it, then colors shift, and the same with saturation. If you saturate, I mean, saturation is effectively a difference in color channels, right? So if you want to achieve a greater
Mhm.
saturation, you need to increase the difference in color channels, which works up to a point, but then it starts to cause hue shifts. Um, yeah, and understanding that kind
Yeah.
of thing is good, and it comes with time, but actually if you don't edit so hard, you don't see these problems so much.
Yeah. I think a really good way to understand that, and it can be hard at first, but if anybody is in Photoshop and they just pull up a photo and then they hit the little color picker button that pulls up that little cube that shows like hue, saturation, luminance, or lightness, or whatever, and you look at that, it gives R, G, and B. And next to each of those colors,
Hmm.
there's a number. So every color only exists. It's just like on a map, or just like longitude, latitude coordinates, right? Every specific color only exists at a specific coordinate on that little cube. And if you make anything brighter or darker, it's actually a brand new color. So anytime you
Yeah.
move things brighter or darker, like you were saying, like dark contrast, if you move your colors around or your exposure around, it changes all those other coordinates as well. And that's hard to get a grasp on when you're first learning about color and light.
Yeah, I mean, and it certainly can. I know the more extreme the changes, the more the color can shift, and there are obviously ways around that to a degree. Like you can change blend modes and so on to stop that kind
Hmm.
of thing happening. But honestly, if you're doing edits that are shifting colors in ways that you don't want them to, you probably want to consider whether you want to be making that edit in the first place. Like you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's look at this next image, the darkness from Lofoten.
That's actually, yeah. I was out there with Arold Heitman. He's a Norwegian photographer. He lives out there, and yeah, we just had a terrible weather week in September. We were actually staying in some of the mountain cabins there, or the huts down at the water, and doing day hikes. And the weather was not with us that week, but we got out into the mountains, and yeah, I thought this was an interesting one from an editing perspective, because it's just that, like, it's really miserable, yeah, oppressive weather that kind of gets you down. But you have to keep shooting, see the potential, the qualities of the scene that you're photographing. And of course, here there was this amazing cloud structure from these showers passing through, and a little bit of rain there too. So that a generates a sense of depth. And
Hmm.
then the editing does play quite an important role in this image, because there's two things that I did. One was add quite a lot of contrast to the clouds to bring out those structures, because ultimately you're trying to kind of recreate the atmosphere of being there. And I think sometimes you can go crazy with that kind of idea, right? If you're shooting a sunset, you just go, oh wow, it was amazing, so I need to turn the saturation up, and you kind of lose the plot a little bit.
Yeah.
But in the case of moody skies, I think it's quite an important step to take to bring in that contrast and that structure. And then I'd like to keep things cold too. I think over warming things, you can start to lose that sense of that mood, that um, yeah, miserableness. So quite often when I'm working with cloudy skies, I'm just staying slightly colder with my white balance, because I that tends to recreate the atmosphere more effectively for me.
Yeah. Yeah. What I like about this one is you control the greens really well in the foreground. I think a mistake that I've often made in the past and that I see all the time is that people think of a tree or like they think of green foliage and they think, well, that should be kind of bright and saturated because for some reason in our mind, green seems
Hmm.
to be that way. But a lot of the nicest looking greens are in like the dark mid tones. And it's hard to realize that that's where they actually
Yeah.
sit in the color space until you actually see it. And then you're like, oh, well, this green looks off because it actually has too much yellow in it. You're talking about keeping the image cool. So a lot of times green
Hmm.
gets a lot of yellow in it.
Yeah.
It gets too bright. And then you lose that really nice textured
Yeah.
green like you have in this image. So I love the color control over it.
The Yeah, I mean, there's two colors I think that are really difficult to work with as a landscape photographer. One is green and one is blue, and unfortunately, they are the two that we see the most. I mean, they kind of handled that with Velvia and Provia with some really clever film chemistry, where your greens, your yellow greens, would often be pushed into slightly bluer
Mhm.
greens, and there's better color separation between the different hues in greens. So you could tell the difference between the fern in front of the moss with the tree leaves, that all different shades of green, and the film was designed in that very specific way. Um, Unfortunately, we do get these yellow greens. Almost certainly with that image, I would have desaturated the greens and possibly slightly pushed them into that more like apple green as opposed to moss yellow green.
Yeah.
And yeah, greens are a big problem, and blues too. If you end up going too cyan with your skies or too magenta with your skies, then they just look weird. And I still struggle with that now, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things that I always see when I'm working on images. If my greens don't look right or my blues don't look right, I'll usually say, well, it's probably a little bit too bright. Or if it's a green, it's the hue's probably pushed a little bit towards yellow too much, or it has too much yellow saturation. And then if it's a blue, like you're saying, it's probably pushed too
Hmm.
much towards cyan, or it's also too bright. So those are like the
Hmm.
first things. If I see the image and I'm like something's a little bit off, those are the things that I'll try to target. So that's interesting that you talk about both of those specific colors being hard to control because I think they're the colors that often make images look wrong, but we don't often think about it in that way either.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think, I mean, we just have a very good eye for those two colors. I think. I guess there's probably an evolutionary
Mhm.
reason behind that. Um, but yeah, I mean, you mentioned the color picker earlier, and it reminded me of a photo because actually, what I did was I separated an image into the color channels and turned it into a bioarray, like it reverse engineered it for an animation for a
Oh,
talk I
cool.
was doing, so that you could bring all the color channels together and show how that worked. And I realized that this blue sky above my sunrise was actually more or less gray, and it only appeared to be blue in contrast to the
Mm.
other colors. So the other thing is like your color vision is very referenced against the other colors you see surrounding that particular color. So it's literally a sunrise, beautiful sunrise in the Drakensberg, and a blue sky above. But I've edited it to be almost grey, but to me it looks very, very blue.
Have you seen the landscape painter Albert Bierstadt's work?
I haven't, no.
I'll have to throw some of those up. I'll put some links below this for anybody that's watching, but he came to the American West back in the late 1800s and he painted these vast landscapes of like the Sierras and a bunch of other stuff, but his ability to select one or two colors to work into the image and then leave the rest not without color, but a very minimal amount of color and it provides so much depth and separation to the image. And if you look at an image that this is the hard part about photo editing. If you've been looking at an image and you've been editing it for like 20 or 30 minutes, your eye will get so tuned into the colors on it. If you walk into another room with different lighting in the room and wait like 20 minutes and then come back to the image, oftentimes you look at it and be like, oh, the colors are all messed up. So often when I can't get the colors right, I'll
Yeah.
just be like, all right, let's go take a 15-minute break under different light and then you come back and it'll click and you'll be like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
that's why that doesn't look right because that color's slightly shifted where it shouldn't be. And
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely don't want to stare at the same
no,
photo for
it
too
makes a
long.
big mess of it. But yeah, Albert Bierstadt is fantastic. I use him to study color theory, what colors work together, but he's just a master of it.
Is he part of that? Is he part of that school of Western
Yeah,
American paint? I
the
can't
Hudson
remember the
River
name of the
School, I think it
school.
was called. Yeah,
Hudson River
yeah, and
School.
I
Yeah,
think
that's right. Which I think. I was chatting to my friend Tim Parkin about this not so long ago, and we were talking about the sort of like embedded visual aesthetic of different cultures and how that can influence photographic
Hmm.
approach now. And he's got a bit of a theory going that the Hudson River School drives a lot of what people consider to be the American landscape and the uh, fantastical atmospheric views that people create either through directly capturing the scene or through processing,
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the embedded visual aesthetic of the nation, if you like, which
I
I think
wouldn't
is
doubt it.
interesting and probably does have some truth to it. Yeah.
And all those, I think those guys are from either Germany. I think some of them from Germany, and then some are from other parts of Europe.
Mhm.
And then I don't know how they got over here, how they got involved in all that stuff. But it would have been amazing to come out to the American West in that era until you got hurt, and then you would just die. but everything else would be really
Yeah,
nice.
sure.
Let's look at one more image, and then we will call it a day. Let's pull up the next one down. And which one which one do you have there for the next one down? You can just discuss through what.
The portrait frame with the
Absolutely.
pink
Yeah, I wanted to
sky
talk
there.
through that one because I really like the color and I like how the color pulls the eyes to different parts of the photo. So if you want to talk through just a little thought process and mentality and how you came up with that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about photographing this scene was it was a very specific plan, not necessarily to shoot this exact frame, but to be in this exact location in these exact conditions. This is a mountain called Leach in Torridon, which is in the Northwest Highlands of Scotland, and it's one of the like real centerpiece mountains in Scotland. It's a really steep climb getting up there. It's difficult to get up there in the snow, and we camped out there on the ridge, and then I photographed this sunrise unfolding. So I did the process that I mentioned at the start of our conversation, where I prepared all of my compositions the evening before, and actually we had full moon, and I had loads of time to like really figure out what I was going to do in the morning, and so I photographed that scene with the light developing, and actually maybe I'll send you some of the other versions of it so that you can compare, because that might be interesting. But I think a lot of photographers would look for the moment that the sun hits the snow in the foreground. There is the like key moment to focus on.
Mhm.
But if I compare the two, that texture becomes really distracting with the contrast of even very soft sunlight on it, and the relief you get on snow in twilight is often very beautiful in itself. And obviously, this is just before sunrise when you've got the sort of high cirrus there really catching the color, and that color palette to me fits together really nicely. But it separates the sky from the ground in a nice way, not in a two halves of an image way. Um, yeah, so I mean, in terms of timing, it's really just getting the subtlety in the textures, because I mean, of course, I had the benefit of being able to actually compare as well, because I could just shoot it ad infinitum. Um, but then compositionally, it just seemed to fit together as well because of these diagonal lines and the sort of pyramidal peaks on the sort of opposite side of the ridge, if that makes sense. You've got a couple of
Yeah.
triangular structures there, and just a strong diagonal coming through, which I've realized is just something that I like to do generally, is use strong diagonals and fairly dominant foregrounds if I have nice textural foregrounds. um, and I mean, just everything came together really well. I mean, obviously just had an amazing morning in terms of conditions, and yeah, it's really exciting being able to come back with a photo like that, having planned so long to get that scene. That was because actually snow is pretty fickle in the Northwest Highlands as well, so it's difficult to get all of the everything working in your favor to make an image like that happen.
Yeah, I think snow like this, where it's textured and it's fresh and light like that, it's just hard to get it to all line up. And I agree with you on shooting this type of snow. It's almost like right before sunrise or right before the light hits directly on the landscape. You get a lot more contrast and color. It's like a light box reflective light that's the sun's below the horizon, so it's reflecting up off the sky. You get that nice color, and then it just reflects down onto the snow. And oftentimes the color on the snow
Mhm.
is way better at that point because it's not a really bright yellow or red, but it's that nice reflected light that you have in the foreground. So I like that as well too. As far as the diagonal lines, that's something that I always look for too. I never really thought through why I chose different compositions until I recently started creating a composition course for. I have an online school where I teach a bunch of people. That's not on YouTube; it's on my website.
Hmm.
But I was trying to think of like, what am I actually looking for in compositions? And two of the things were really strong foreground. I just call it an anchor point. Make basically something in the foreground that just grabs your eyes right away and say, "Hey, look at me." And then from that anchor point,
Hmm.
diagonals lead you from that anchor point somewhere else into the image, usually back one way and then the other way back through. And it just keeps things interesting no
Hmm.
matter where they are. But it doesn't have to be like an object that's diagonal. It can even be like you have here. It is an object, it's snow, but it's also a contrast change from light to dark where it drops off that cliff. And then it holds that
Yeah.
light to dark contrast the whole way back. And then it changes to really dark where it drops down into the tree line, which also maintains that nice diagonal. So I think that can work great.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Your eye just likes to follow diagonal lines,
Yeah,
basically, doesn't it? I mean, I think in in artistic circles you call a diagonal line a dynamic line, and a horizontal or vertical line you call that a static line, and they certainly have that effect when you're looking at photo. Yeah, so it's I guess it's a well established technique to use diagonals in compositions, but I particularly like doing it. I do actively look for diagonals.
absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to go over all your photos. And I learned a lot from you. And if you want to give a few places people can find you, check out your work. And then I'll leave a bunch of links under that everybody can follow as well.
Yeah, so my website is alexnell.com. And I suppose I should mention if you're into what Dave's doing. I mean, I do some adventure trips where I do take clients out into some wilderness destinations, but within the reach of beginner hikers. I don't go to the extremes that you do, Dave. So um, yeah, and then my YouTube channel, which I am trying to grow, starting small, is yeah, you should be able to find that. I guess you can link to that, Dave. But yeah, thanks
Yeah.
very much for having me. It's been really good chatting, giving me a platform. Always a dangerous thing.
Oh, it's all good. It was a blast, man. Anybody else that wants to check out Alex's stuff, the places that I've seen that he takes people on workshops look absolutely phenomenal. And the lighting looks cool. The locations are unique. You don't see many photos from there. And if you guys want to learn technical stuff on everything we were just talking about, you can check out Alex's YouTube channel. I think he does a great job at just explaining what actually matters as far as the learning process versus all the fluff you don't really need. So check that stuff out, and you guys can get a long ways with just that basic understanding and knowledge. So thanks for being here, Alex. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. God, I need to hire you as my marketing manager. I think that was
Dude,
much better than I
I'll do it.
managed.
All right, man. Have a good day.